Well, what a joy to be in the house of the Lord on a Wednesday night. So, children and teachers, you may go. And the rest of us, let's go outside now. When are the adult park nights? That's what I'm looking forward to. So this evening we are going to look at Psalm 13. I'm excited to go through this psalm. As with many of the psalms, Psalm 13 is comforting because of the honest feelings of the psalmist and how they're so relatable and transparent in the psalm. And I know I've said this before, but the psalms offer us a personal view of the thoughts and feelings of a person who is following the Lord in a variety of life circumstances. And we get to see the ups and the downs, and Psalm 13 specifically is a remarkable journey of faith in only 6 verses. It has a lot of instructive moments, and it is a great privilege to walk through them with you this evening. So let's first read the whole psalm together, and then we'll take it line by line. So this is Psalm 13. For the choir director, a psalm of David. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken. But I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So Psalm 13 divides itself neatly into 3 sections. Each section is 2 verses, although it is always helpful to remember that the verse numbers were added later. But we have the luxury of going line by line this evening because the psalm isn't that long. The first section is a list of questions for the Lord, and we get a sense of desperation even from the first question. How long, O Lord? It isn't even a full thought. It's a fragment, an exclamation. How long? We don't even know what the psalmist is talking about until the next question. Will you forget me forever? So we get a clearer picture now with this second question. The psalmist feels abandoned. He is wondering if his present circumstances are going to last forever. And that wondering is probably because he has experienced the same circumstance over and over and over again, or worse than that, the same circumstance has been constant for some time. There has been no rest from the difficulty, and the Lord has been silent. He's not intervened. But we get a little more information from the next line. How long will you hide your face from me? Now, this is another question, but it has a little bit of a different feeling. Having someone forget about you is different than having them hide their face from you. More than just forgotten, the psalmist feels that the Lord is purposefully ignoring him, that the Lord is actively turning away from him. This forgetting is not by accident, but on purpose. And verse 2 brings more questions and more potential for us to see perhaps ourselves in the place of the psalmist. He says, "How long shall I take counsel in my soul?" This is a phrase that doesn't translate particularly smoothly. You wouldn't hear someone normally say, talk about taking counsel in their soul. But it's kind of like taking advice from yourself. You are looking to yourself to solve the issues before you. It is worrying and being anxious because if you don't figure it out, then there is no one else to help. It is trying to find every possible earthly solution and seeing them each fail one by one until you are out of ideas. And that, to me, is a very relatable place to have a life circumstance where you are just trying so hard to figure it out yourself and feeling like you are alone in that endeavor. And where is the Lord in that moment? So verse 2 brings more questions, and the next one, which kind of makes sense why the idea of taking counsel in yourself, in your seeking your own advice, is followed by having sorrow in my heart all the day. How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? Yeah, I am thankful that the Lord put in his word such human words. The psalmist is made of the same weak flesh that we are, and it isn't covered up. The Bible does not sugarcoat the difficulties of life, but it exposes them. And even a child of God can be brought to a place of constant sorrow. Even the anointed king of God's chosen people can be overcome with sadness, can feel abandoned. So, what do we know at this point? The psalmist is asking pointed questions to the Lord. Will you forget me forever? How long am I going to have to figure this out on my own? How long will I be constantly sad with no end in sight? And then the next question, how long will my enemy be exalted over me? And we get a little more information as we start to kind of unpack what this is all about. The psalmist has an enemy that is pressing down on him in some way. We don't know the exact situation, but there is a real situation that is happening, and at this moment, it is engulfing the vision of the psalmist. And this brings up another point. Almost certainly, the psalmist's exalted enemy is not following the one true God, is not worshiping Yahweh. There are unbelievers today who seem to go through life being exalted. They seem to overcome great obstacles in this life without the Lord. They seem to live triumphant lives, and when we are struggling, it can challenge our faith deeply. So we come to the end of this first section, and I hope that you have a sense, a strong feeling for what the psalmist is feeling, that you can sympathize or empathize with that situation of feeling hopeless, not just forgotten, but turned away from. And that you are in a situation where you have tried everything and it hasn't worked. But now that he's asked a lot of questions, in verse 3 we get something new. Not a question, but a request. Read it with me. Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Every word, every part of this request is important. The first part, consider. Listen to what I am saying. See my situation. Hear my concerns. Then the second part, answer me. Don't just listen, but give me an answer. I cannot stand your silence any longer. Please respond. And then the third part, O Lord my God. The psalmist is declaring that Yahweh isn't just God, but that Yahweh is his God. He ends his request with a personal confession of faith. And pay attention to this. A confession of faith is not just for our baptism, the beginning of our journey as a Christian. The Psalms are filled with confessions of faith at all types of crossroads, at all types of moments in a believer's life. We don't just confess our faith when we're saved. We can and should confess our faith through trials, which is exactly what's happening here. Even in the middle of his deep sorrow, the psalmist declares that the Lord is his God. And then we get the second request: enlighten my eyes. Enlighten my eyes is an interesting phrase. It isn't a phrase we use in English, but the Hebrew reader would be familiar with it. And there are two kind of connected ways to think about this phrase, enlighten my eyes. The first is about mood and attitude. There's another Hebrew phrase that is lift up my countenance. And your countenance is your facial expression. And so a fallen countenance is a sad or angry face. The sides of the mouth, the forehead, the whole head is low. And we can relate to this, the idea of, lifting the countenance is changing from sadness to joy. And so enlightening the eyes kind of has the same feeling. Turn my sorrow and grief to joy. Change my heart. And we can relate to this way of understanding the phrase because we do talk about people's eyes lighting up when they are excited about something. It's not exactly the same meaning, but the idea of light in the eyes having to do with a more positive feeling. So that's the first way, that enlighten my eyes, change my heart so that I can go from sorrow to joy. And then the second way to consider this term, enlighten my eyes, is to think about understanding. The first way is focused on what is communicated to others through our eyes. But because we can often tell someone's mood or attitude from their eyes, I've gotten especially good at this teaching in a public school because that's literally all I can see of their face at this point, and the same thing for them. So I can still tell, when a middle schooler is having a bad day, just from the eyes. But and I'm sure they can tell when I'm having a bad day. Uh-oh, Mr. Guidry, watch out. But we tend to trust our eyes the other way, the other direction. What about what is communicated to us through our own eyes? Our eyes are really important. It's a way we gather information about the world. It is why we have eyewitnesses and phrases like seeing is believing. So enlightening the eyes is a plea that God would make the psalmist see the situation rightly, that God would shed light on the situation, and that would allow the psalmist to see the truth. And it is obvious how these two meanings are connected. If God sheds light on the situation, allows us to see the truth of the situation, it is going to change our attitude and our hearts. And in both meanings, the Lord is the light source. We do not have the willpower to just change our attitude in the face of overwhelming circumstances. And we don't have the power to see the truth of every situation. We rely on God to make his face to shine upon us, to light our path through the darkness, to guide us into all truth, and to be our hope in the midst of adversity. And what will happen if those two things don't happen? If I can't see the truth of the situation, or I'm left alone in despair, and the situation comes to its natural conclusion, we see the next phrase: or I will sleep the sleep of death. From the psalmist's perspective now, death is the only other option. If you haven't felt the desperation of the psalmist up to this point, here it is. And as critical readers, we can either accuse the psalmist of melodrama, of being overly sensitive about the situation, or we can take him at his word as a man who is really in an agonizing situation. And to be honest, scholars do both. You see both sides of the spectrum here. But the seriousness and the careful crafting of the Psalms up to this point convinces me to take the psalmist at his word. And to once again consider, what would it take for me to be in a situation like this, feeling that without an immediate answer, without the Lord changing my heart, that death was imminent? That's a sobering thought. And it's a helpful one as we approach the Psalms to think, what would it take for me to say these words? What would have to happen in my life for me to say these words? And that brings us to verse 4. Verse 4 says, "And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken." And this is such a human moment in the psalm. If you want to understand human behavior, the Psalms are a great place to start. The psalmist has just told us that he fears that death is near if the Lord doesn't intervene. And you would think that death would be the height of his concern. But verse 4 shows that there are prospects that in the moment seem even worse than death to us. And I know I can relate to this at some level, but it's one thing to be utterly defeated. But when others rejoice in that defeat, there is something emotionally gripping about that. It makes us really angry or deeply sad. It is one thing to fail at something that you've worked so hard for, but then at that moment of failure, you look over and see people who are so happy that you have failed. That is, for some reason, much worse to the human heart. Like, it's not logical. Should it be that way? Should it make it worse? It doesn't seem like it should. Either way, you failed, but God has made us to be social beings, and we care how other people perceive us, even our enemies. And the psalmist is no exception. The rejoicing of his adversaries adds salt to the wound. But this word shaken at the end of verse 4, it's interesting. It can also mean to be overthrown. And this same word actually occurred in Psalm 10, just a few psalms back, where the psalmist was quoting the wicked. The wicked were saying, "I will not be moved. Throughout all generations, I will not be in adversity." And that moved is the same Hebrew word as shaken here in Psalm 13. My adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken, overthrown. And back in Psalm 10, the wicked saying, "I will not be moved or overthrown." And I find that comparison to be really telling. The child of God, the follower of Yahweh, does not believe he will be free from adversity. The child of God knows how fragile he or she is, how helpless apart from the Lord. And that should be a clear separator in thinking between the believer and the unbeliever. The unbeliever says, "I'm fine on my own." And the believer says, "I'm dead and lost on my own." And I find it comforting that even before the Lord has answered his prayer to enlighten his eyes, the psalmist already sees more clearly in the darkness than his proud enemies in Psalm 10. And that's a helpful reminder for us as believers. Even in our distress, even when we feel overwhelmed, just the act of seeking the Lord in that circumstance, even if we don't feel like he's paying attention, is an indication that we are his. But thankfully, the psalmist does not leave it there. Verse 5. "But I have trusted in your loving kindness." Here we have a pretty remarkable turn. If we had stopped at the end of verse 4, there's no indication that this turn was on the horizon. It only takes one word, and we've been encouraged by multiple preachers here at TCBC to pay close attention when the word "but" is in the text. It is a bright, blinking signal. And it's a signal that everything that has been mentioned before is about to be changed radically by a new piece of information. And this "but" is no exception. All of the feelings of being alone, of unending sorrow, of constant failure to fix things on his own, of being completely conquered by the circumstances of life and by his enemies, all of that becomes insignificant because of this one line. But I have trusted in your loving kindness. And I love this because as we have looked through the first 12 Psalms, this topic of faith in the Lord and seeking refuge in the Lord and trusting in the Lord, it has been the constant marker of the righteous. Righteousness is about acknowledging our inability, our need, and casting ourselves into the care of the Lord because we know he is both able and he desires to save. But here we see something instructive. As believers, we can say that we trust in the Lord, but it is helpful in the strengthening of our faith to say why we trust in the Lord. And here in verse 5, in this pivotal moment of the psalm, we get a specific attribute of God that pushes the psalmist to trust in the Lord. He says, I have trusted in your loving kindness. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I have put my trust in you, but as a frail, weary sinner who is prone to wander, remembering the attributes of God, who he is, what kind of God we trust in, that builds up our faith. And the psalmist models this kind of thinking for us. In times of great trial, it is helpful to recount, to recall, to remember who God is. So the word here, loving kindness, is a Hebrew word that I think it would be helpful for every believer to know. It is the word chesed. And it is in the Old Testament 248 times. In fact, it was in Psalm 103 that we learned about on Sunday. And chesed can be translated as mercy, goodness, faithfulness. But I'm partial to the NASB's translation, loving kindness, here for a few reasons. First, it is not a normal word in the English language. Putting loving and kindness together as one word is not outside of Scripture something that you see. And chesed absolutely deserves its own unique English word, in my humble opinion. And combining these two words, loving and kindness, really makes sense here. It is kindness. And for our purposes, let's define kindness as showing favor and tenderness towards someone. But in this word, that kindness is motivated by a deep love for the person. So someone can show favor or tenderness towards others for many reasons. But here, love is the motivation, and that deep love is a foundation for continued kindness, for continued favor and tenderness. When deep love is the motivating factor, it is not going to change. Therefore, the kindness is going to continue, and that is where the translation faithfulness would come in. So kind of bringing it full, we have mercy, we have goodness, we have faithfulness, this kindness that is undergirded by love that will not change. And throughout the Old Testament, it is not just used of God, but of close familial relationships. So just a few examples. The spies showed chesed to Rahab when they spared her life and accepted her into the nation of Israel after destroying Jericho. Ruth showed chesed to Naomi when she refused to leave her and eventually sought the kinsman redeemer of her family. And David showed chesed to Jonathan by bringing Mephibosheth into his home and restoring all of the land of his grandfather Saul back to his family. But just like many of God's attributes, God's chesed exceeds the normal human usage. And no place is this better seen than in the dedication of Solomon's temple. This happens in 2 Chronicles 6 and 7. You don't have to turn there tonight. But chapter 6 is the dedication and Solomon's prayer. And the beginning of chapter 7 is Yahweh's response to the dedication. And so I'm going to read a little bit of the beginning of chapter 7 to you. Now when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. And the priests could not enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. All the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, "Truly, he is good. Truly, his loving kindness is everlasting." When the Lord came down and inhabited the temple, the only response that the people there could give was to fall on their faces and acknowledge the goodness and hesed of the Lord, and that his hesed was everlasting. And that cannot be said for any simple human loving kindness or faithfulness. Now, Psalm 13 was most likely written before Solomon's temple was built. But the Lord was the same. He has not changed. And his loving kindness was the same as well. But when we dwell, like the psalmist does, on this attribute of God, it is easy to see how this one line in the psalm changes everything. I have trusted in your loving kindness. And so I ask you, what could you put your trust in that would approach God's hesed, his everlasting favor and kindness that is motivated by his deep love for you? If you have your trust in that, you are going to go exactly where the psalmist does in the next line. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. You see, the practical result of God's loving kindness is salvation. He has promised to save those who seek refuge in him. And so I want to come back to something we talked about earlier, the personal confession of faith. It's not just for baptism alone. It's not just in every trial where we restate our trust in the Lord, but we continue to confess our faith through joyful circumstances as well. And how do we do that? We attribute every good thing that we receive to the Lord alone. We say, Lord, this is your salvation. Every good thing that I have comes from you. That is a confession of faith. And this psalm is remarkable because it starts out as a crisis of faith. But throughout the whole psalm, it becomes a continual confession of faith, of trust, of seeking refuge, of exulting in the loving kindness of the Lord. And sure, we confess our faith at conversion, but it continues daily as we cry out to the Lord in trials, as we rejoice at his salvation, and even as we sing to him in gladness. And that's exactly what the psalmist vows to do in verse 6 to finish up the psalm. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. And isn't that a great reason to sing? I promised myself that I wouldn't plug choir, but Sunday mornings we're here singing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with us. So it's amazing to see the psalmist get from the beginning of the psalm to the end, to see the pivotal thought, the turning point, trusting in the Lord's loving kindness as the way that he can come from utter despair to hope. And not just a little hope, but enough hope to declare that the Lord has dealt bountifully with him, and enough hope to sing the Lord's praises. And so as we finish up this devotional this evening, I just want to draw out a few points of application. First, times of doubt and worry are a part of the Christian life because we are imperfect. The Lord is perfect, and we can always cast all our anxieties on him, but sometimes it takes us time to get there. And he is gracious to us in that time. And it's my prayer that as God changes me, that I would be quicker and quicker to take my anxieties straight to him. And Psalm 13 is a blueprint for handling doubt in the face of truly difficult circumstances. Trusting in the Lord is not about downplaying the difficulty of our circumstances, saying, oh, it's not that bad. Trusting in the Lord is saying, no matter how bad it gets, and it might get worse, the Lord is in control and I can rely on him no matter what. The second point of application is how our lives can be a continual confession of faith. And we saw through the psalm how we can confess our faith in times of difficulty by seeking refuge in the Lord, And we can also confess our faith in times of joy and triumph by attributing every good thing to the Lord. You know, any success that we have is not a result of our power ultimately, but because every power we have is a gift from the Lord. And when we acknowledge that it is the Lord's gift to us and not anything that we've accomplished alone, that is a public confession of faith. And then finally, as we seek to confess our faith in every part of our lives, we can continue to dwell on the attributes of God. Our faith can be strengthened when we consider what it is about God that makes him fully deserving of our trust and our praise. Have you ever done something for so long and someone asks you why you do it that way and you have no idea? It's just how you've always done it. Trusting in the Lord shouldn't be that way. We should have an answer ready when someone asks why we trust in the Lord. Really, we could have a myriad of answers. When someone asks you why you trust in the Lord, you should be able to respond with, well, how much time do you have? In Psalm 13, the psalmist cites the Lord's loving kindness, and that is a great place to start, but that just scratches the surface when we consider why the Lord is deserving of our praise and trust. So I trust that going through Psalm 13 has been as much of a joy and encouragement to you as it has been to me in preparing it. But let's pray together. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you that you have put in it just the truth about humanity. And you have put in it people who have the same frailties that we do and the same struggles that we do and are honest with you, bringing them to you, that can give us a pattern to follow. And I pray that we would be quicker to bring the troubles that we hold inside and sometimes try to solve ourselves, that we would bring them quickly to you and remember that your loving kindness, no matter what the situation looks like, is stronger than whatever it is that we're facing. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.